Hello and welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm John Bachman. Joining us now is Thomas Sowell. He's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. He's also an expert on tax policy and the economy. His new essay is called Trickle-Down Theory and Tax Cuts for the Rich. It's just 13 pages and something everyone should read before they vote this November. Thanks for being with us today, sir.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure, my pleasure. Once again, we're hearing a lot about trickle-down theory. This election cycle, Democrats and Republicans have presented contrasting visions for the economy. President Obama says he wants to raise taxes on the rich to balance the budget. In your essay, though, you explain why that won't work. Why hasn't it worked in the past?
Well, you can raise the tax rate as much as you want, whenever you want, but that in no way means that you're going to collect more tax revenue. In fact, any number of times throughout history, and not only in this country, but in other countries, people have raised tax rates and the tax revenue collected has gone down. It happened in Britain recently when they proposed a 51% top rate, and they collected less revenue then than they had with a lower rate. Back in the 1920s, the top rate was 73% in 1921. Over the years, they brought it down to 24%. At 24%, they collected far more revenue than they collected at 73%. And the simple reason is that when the rates get very high, people put their money into tax-exempt securities, or they invest them in foreign countries, or do something else to keep the money from being collected. Andrew Mellon in the 20s pointed out the government collected the same amount of revenue when the top tax rate was 13% as when it was 65%. So the grand illusion that everyone in the media seems to have is if you need more money, you just raise the tax rates and the revenue will come pouring in.
At one point in the essay you write, and I'm quoting you here, Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon was the key figure in getting tax rates lowered in the 1920s. If you were asked to pick the next Treasury Secretary, someone who would be like Secretary Andrew Mellon, who would you pick?
Oh, Art Laffer. He's credited with saying, you know, that you can sometimes get more revenue at a lower tax rate. But of course, that same argument was made before Art Laffer was born. It's just that over the years, people have forgotten it. They've forgotten how often the tax rates and tax revenues have moved in opposite directions.
Over the last few years, we've also heard a lot about Keynesian economics, the belief that the government should inject policy and supply capital into the economy when the private sector is not doing so well. And I found it incredibly interesting to learn in your essay that you wrote that John Maynard Keynes seemed to understand the limits of taxation. Why do some liberal economists out there, particularly Paul Krugman, fail to acknowledge this?
It has been so long since I have bothered to read Paul Krugman that I have no idea what he's acknowledged or not acknowledged.
But in terms of Keynes, that quote, he talks about the limits of taxation. Why do you think, aside from Krugman, why that's not included in the liberal economist argument?
I think that if we back up to the beginning of income taxation under Woodrow Wilson, back in those days there was a far more realistic understanding in both political parties that high tax rates don't necessarily bring in more revenue. More important, there was an understanding that high tax rates have further repercussions when investors put their money in tax shelters instead of investing it in the economy. Over the years, however, and especially toward the end of the 20th century, it became a partisan issue, and that the new Democratic Party, the sort of post-McGovern Democratic Party, chose to say that the tax cuts are just for the benefit of the rich, when in fact the whole point, John F. Kennedy and others, is that lower tax rates cause higher rates of investment, and that creates jobs. By the same token, if you're going to raise the tax rates high, and by high I don't mean high necessarily with regard to historic standards, I mean higher than in other countries, then it pays people with lots of money to put their money in other countries, and the jobs go to those other countries. Now, it's very easy electronically to try to transfer $1 million here or there. It's not easy for a job seeker to transfer himself to some other country where the jobs have been created.
In reference to the tax cuts of the 1920s and perhaps 2001 and 2003, we also hear an argument from liberals that say, hey, look, what followed those tax cuts, there was some economic growth, there was higher tax revenue, sure, but eventually we had dramatic economic disasters. Is it a fallacy to relate the Great Depression and the Great Recession to tax policy?
I think so, because with the recession that we're now in, It's quite clear that this is the aftermath of the housing boom, which was done in such a way that the bust was absolutely inevitable from the beginning. And this is not hindsight. I said this in the Wall Street Journal a couple of years before it happened, and other people said it elsewhere before I did. So this is not something new.
You know, and I'm going to talk to you about one more argument you hear coming from liberals is the current tax rates. Wealth has been concentrated into the hands of less people. Essentially, the rich keep getting richer even under President Obama. What's the best way to address the concerns of the people who hold this view?
I don't worry about the rich getting richer. I do worry about the poor getting poorer. And that's what's been happening on a much larger scale. The difference between reality and political impression is huge. Back in the 1980s, that is during the Reagan administration, the income gap between blacks and whites narrowed somewhat. Under Obama, it has widened. And yet Obama is regarded as a great friend of the blacks, and he will undoubtedly get a huge proportion of black votes. Ronald Reagan was never regarded that way. So we have a set of visions out there that operate independently of facts. And
so in other words, if President Obama was really taking on the issue of advocating for the poor, he would be calling for lower taxes.
Oh, absolutely. Among other things, he would also not be creating all kinds of bureaucratic regulations which are still being promulgated. They haven't even finished, so that there wouldn't be this huge amount of uncertainty facing anyone who wants to invest in a business. You have no idea what it's going to cost you to hire somebody, for example, until all the regulations of Obamacare are promulgated. And that can take years.
And you do hear uncertainty brought up a lot by business leaders and job creators as the reason why they feel like the economy is struggling most. I do want to talk about recent poll numbers as well. They suggest that Governor Romney has failed to make his case on the economy and taxes to the American people. What does he need to do other than start quoting the essay you just wrote to change the momentum in this race?
He has to be specific. He has to explain. He has to reply even to ridiculous arguments. Republicans seem to think that if a certain argument is silly, they don't need to pay any attention to it. A lot of things that Hitler said was silly, but we would have been a lot better off if we paid attention to it and countered it when he said it.
Well, we'll see if Governor Romney gets a little more specific, as he's expected to do in the upcoming debates now, less than 1 week away. The new essay is called Trickle-Down Theory and Tax Cuts for the Rich. It's available now for free at tsowell.com. Thomas Sowell, it's been a pleasure having this discussion with you.
Thank you.